Okay, so I'm going to talk today about threatened cultural sites of the Catlett Islands, Gloucester County, Virginia. This wonderful aerial view is brought to us by one of members I have at my organization. We do a lot of work with drones, dealing with preservation, but also documenting landscape change. And this includes shoreline change over time because of the intersection with the archaeological sites that are now eroding off or sinking. So it's something that kind of we've gotten used to using, but also in a lot of ways connects people between the places they know and the places that are being really directly affected by climate change. And so finding a way to build bridges between these places in a figurative sense is really starting to pay off for us when it comes to not just the scientific data of being able to take photogrammetry models and compare them as times change, but also going through and just having the visual marker. The image that you see in the foreground, the parking area and then the small house, it's actually quite large house, and this is part of the new Machicomico State Park, I'll reference briefly. But there's a direct connection between the cultural landscape on the uplands of the Timberneck property or the Catlett property, and then the Catlett Islands, known for the or called by the name of the same family, that are in the background, or not full background. That's the other side of the York River, but here we're looking south, and it gives you a bit of a sense of the elevation change and the perspective. I hate reading slides. I figure you guys can read them yourselves. But I know some of you are just kind of listening with this in the background, so I'll do a quick summary. We're going to talk about the Catlett Islands. It's a subset of a larger area known as Timberneck in the kind of local vernacular for Gloucester County. And when the state of Virginia purchased the property on the uplands to create the new Machicomico State Park, it created both an opportunity and potentially a really significant challenge for VIMS. VIMS is the cultural manager, CBNERR-VA, as the people in charge of managing those islands, both for their study, but also for the people who like to go out there and to hunt and to fish and occasionally like to camp out there, even though they're not allowed to. It, for us, was a great opportunity to build on some prior work that archaeologists had done, but much to our surprise, the archaeologists had never asked anyone at VIMS if they could have permission to actually access the islands. And one of the greatest opportunities that came for us is just being able to pick up the phone and call people that we knew at VIMS. And they were like, great, this would be wonderful. As opposed to the usual fear from a lot of archaeologists that engaging with people who are living would produce problems. Um, so it's nice to be able to work with Scott Lerberg and Alex and Hank and Circe and everyone at VIMS because I think they're just excited to work with some folks slightly outside of their field. And then we can learn about these things. And it's really this juxtaposition between the Catlett House and the uplands area, because it includes both historic occupations and indigenous peoples who were there prior to settlement at Jamestown. And it includes small encampments and big villages. The islands are connected in a way that they were a great place to procure raw material, to find food, and also for a place of residence in a shorter period. The larger village is actually up in the uplands. And so having this juxtaposition is great for studying that period that generally is referred to as the prehistoric period, although we're getting away from that term. But also the historic period, most of the islands, as you'll see in the presentation, were occupied by a variety of different groups at different times, including enslaved Africans and African Americans prior to the Civil War. And then we're pretty sure we're looking at watermen and small-scale agriculturalists who are utilizing the islands in the post-Civil War period. Also a quick pitch. My email is down at the bottom here and the cell phone for my organization. If you know of anybody who's got any background on the islands, wants to share that, we're always interested in hearing. And if you think it's weird for me to ask a bunch of folks who may never have heard of the islands before, we get lucky just enough that it makes it worth to put in that slide. So the map you see here on the left shows in the green boxes some areas that have been investigated archaeologically. So one blue polygon, that's the National Register property known as Timberneck. The house in particular, that's what you're seeing illustrated from the 1980s in the upper right-hand corner. And in the 19-aughts, 19-teens in the lower right-hand corner. Say hi to all the sheep. We hope one day to bring the sheep back. The map on the left, though, also shows a lot of these red circles or ovoids. These are all known archaeological sites. And you'll notice on the Catlett Islands on the bottom left, you'll see a lot of them are just along the shoreline. not a lot of excavation or survey was done by people outside of observation. And so that observation was just looking at eroding deposits. So they were recording sites from various periods, almost exclusively from the woodland period, which is several thousand years ago, essentially that same period where indigenous peoples in Virginia had the technology to work with ceramics. And it was before the period of more consistent exposure to European cultures through trade and travel. A quick little sneak peek at the house itself. The house is very cool. It's not the focus of this presentation, but my organization is working with the state of Virginia, Department of Conservation and Recreation, to restore the house. And this will hopefully have exhibits that people can learn about that go a little deeper into the park's overall interpretation. That interpretation does focus on indigenous peoples in Virginia. We're hoping that our component can actually kind of expand on that. We can talk about indigenous peoples after the settlement at Jamestown. We can talk about maybe some other historic and other outwardly oriented public organizations in Virginia, specifically in Gloucester and the Middle Peninsula area. So it's giving us some space to orient towards that. And we're including a lodging option. That way, the revenues from the lodging can help us sustain the exhibits and public programming and, generally speaking, show off a really cool house. Some quick little floor plans, because floor plans are cool, but also on the right-hand side, you can see some of the folks who were living there in the 20th century. This is the Catlett family. And again, showing pictures of people doing work, existing within these spaces often brings a lot of humanity to the work that we do. And at one time, you can see a lot of these other large, massive buildings. This was a substantial farm. It was a dairy. It provided a lot of the milk for the local schools. It also sold grain. It had a cemetery, which is what you see in the bottom section, the bottom two photos there. Kind of exactly what you'd expect for a large historic farmstead, and then earlier than that, a large historic plantation. We do like to bring in maps. We like to look at different components. People who've done previous archaeology in the uplands found all of these red polygons, which mark different occupations, different periods. 387 in the center is the house. The blue outline is that National Register property, but I'm really wanting to draw in the base maps, what's beneath it. So on the far left, you can see an 1857 coastal survey map. And all of this is being drawn from the water, but they're doing an excruciating amount of detail here that's really quite impressive. In the center section is the early USDA 1937 aerials. A lot of these, the first time I was exposed to it was because of VIMS and the shoreline data that they're pulling from that. And so it's helping us in a cultural manner as well. Now, as archaeologists, most of the time you're thinking of folks like what you see in this photo. So somebody's got a screen on the left. They're digging small holes in the ground. You're near historic buildings. But with a park system like this, we have a lot of things that are going to be developed in the uplands area. And there's this desire to go ahead and understand where there are resources so that the development doesn't destroy them. The same thing goes with the Catlett Islands as well. Part of our goal is to understand, where certain changes of the environment, man-made or otherwise, are going to take place, and how we might be able to study the resources left behind by past occupants in a way that will ultimately help us kind of understand this landscape, whether it's going to go ahead and disappear or not. Again, I wanted to kind of bring in some of the other map resources that we have. Upper left-hand corner, again, is that 1857 nautical chart. The key with this, and I'll have a blow up in a few slides, is that it shows the specific locations of many different occupations that are down on the islands. And for a lot of folks, they didn't really even think of the islands as ever being occupied. They're like, oh, well, it's always been that way because of the historical memory that most of them are relying on. And as you see, the maps change over time. There's a certain backup to that incorrect assumption. So the United States Geological Survey map you see in 2018, 2019, that's kind of in the center upper section, doesn't really show anything down there that would reflect human occupation. And to some degree, the same goes with the more modern aerial that you see in the bottom center. But if you look at that 1937 aerial on the left, it really does end up showing you little blips of what human influence had on the islands. And even the far right map, which is a map provided to us by VIMS, weren't responsible for putting that one together. But it very clearly shows not just the infrastructure that they're putting in for study, but also a couple of things that we didn't even know were there until they showed us, including the little black dots as hunting cabin. So there's some continued human engagement on the islands, and it certainly brings to our eyes the kind of influence that will happen when you have that kind of engagement. Now, the further back we look, the more likely we're to find artifacts that often look like little pieces of mud. Um, they're not the easiest thing to identify. Sometimes it just looks like gravel. But in the center right, you can see a projectile point kind of pointing to the right, several flakes of stone that were used, or actually that came away from the manufacturer of a stone tool. On the left, you can see several fragments of what we call Virginia Indian ceramic, some with different indentations and some with different tempers. These definitely represent ceramics that are manufactured at different times throughout the woodland period. Some of them are 500 years old, some of them are 1,000, 1,500 years old. And we can tell by the temper and the surface treatment. So when we go out to the islands, this is essentially what we're expecting to find, at least on the south faces, where most of the settlements for Virginia Indians appear to have been. And then looking at where those are eroding and see if we can recover some of this in situ before it's lost to the wave turbulence. These two maps, again, like I said before, I wanted to kind of bring closer attention to, because if you look very closely, there's two things. The first, the maps are relatively accurate, and for a mid-19th century map, it's pretty exciting for an archaeologist. When we're looking at these, it's not a direct one-to-one correlation, but you can see there's certainly some shoreline loss on the left. You can see where the most of the red polygons were things that were identified as shorelines, and then there's significant amount of land that's been essentially taken away over time. But those field divisions on small portions of the island, the difference between forested and non-forested, small little plots of land. One of the fun things has been going and searching for these, and we have GPS units and GIS, and working alongside VIMS, we can essentially just kind of plug in the coordinates, and then it'll beep to us when we get there. And amazing things are found when we got there. So just very simple things in some ways. The upper left-hand corner shows a plate fragment, a beautiful rim to it, but it's been in the water for a long time. And the lower left section is the site it came from. In this case, it's the concrete and brick piers, probably from the late 19th or early 20th century, for a house that's used to be on land, and now it's just the foundation that is visible at low tide. In the upper right-hand corner is a windmill. Not the first thing you'd expect to find when walking through a bunch of islands, but it's sitting there right on the ground and is part of a 6-building complex that we think was certainly there in the early 20th century as perhaps a small little fishing company or wharf area. But it also overlaps exactly with the location of a settlement mapped on the 1857 shoreline map. In the lower right-hand corner, I just had to throw this one in. That is indeed the kitchen sink. We find a little bit of everything. And what I want to show with this slide is the kind of testing that we've been able to do with VIM staff. These are two archaeologists. Elizabeth is on the left, Katie is on the right, and we're doing what's called shovel testing. These are small 1-foot diameter holes in the ground we take down to the sterile clay. We don't have to take them down a ton of distance, but what we can do is take the artifacts that are found within them and use them and their spatial location, their context with other artifacts to talk about what's going on at a specific site at a specific time. So we're recording data with each sample, but we're also visiting these islands only with VIM staff. And so they're making sure that we're not going to upset one of their studies. And so we're learning a lot from them about what they're expecting to learn from the island. And then we're also sharing with them our knowledge so that as they're working through and maintaining the islands, they can bring to our attention when something comes up of cultural significance. And that relationship has proven to be really great. And I think we're basically in about year 2 or 3 of a multi-year approach. This is the second to last slide. Wanted to show you that, in fact, yes, we did find some artifacts in the lower right-hand corner. The blue shell-edge ceramic is actually early to mid-19th century, so that's some of the first indications of potential occupations similar to what we were seeing in the map on the left. That map on the left, all of those red polygons are known inventoried archaeological sites. These are ones that are already listed at the state. It's not any special significance, it just means that they found at least 3 artifacts. What we were searching for are the green ones that will complement the red ones. And the green ones, again, are all taken from this 1857 U.S. Coastal Survey. And really happy to report that we've done enough testing to confirm at least 4 of these locations. And so it's giving us great hope in that the next round of funding we request, we can go ahead and come back and do a little bit more testing, potentially even have these incorporated into a listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Because so seldom do people look at sites like this. And even though the threat is imminent, And we really are looking at losing these resources within the next 20 to 30 years. It's certainly giving us an opportunity now to work with scientists and potentially members of the public, at least sharing with them this data, that there's a lot that can be learned from the enslaved African and African American occupations that these icons essentially represent. And along the way, we're hoping to learn more than that. A little bit about the 20th century, a little bit about hopefully the 17th century, and then definitely more about the Native American components that are on the sites. So that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to entertain any questions that you guys might have. Very happy to be invited to the conference, and looking forward to hopefully presenting on some follow-up work that we're doing in the next year at the next conference. Thank you.